our series on the future of capitalism. I'm delighted today to welcome Gerrol, who is co-founder and CEO of NEXUS. NEXUS is an organization that spans wealth and social impact, and so a very important topic as we think about capitalism and how it's developing. She's widely recognized for her work on millennial philanthropy and community building, featured in the New York Times, the Financial Times, the Atlantic, Forbes, Vanity Fair, and many more publications. Rachel helped organize the White House Conference on Next Generation Philanthropy and Impact Investing, and worked with Vice President Biden at the time on the It's On Us campaign at universities. Rachel received the Beacon Award, and in 2019 was honored with the Making Change-Making History Award too. Named in the top 99 foreign policy leaders under 33 by the Diplomatic Courier at the time, Rachel co-chaired the G8 Young Summit in 2013, co-founded the Impact House program at the Sundance Film Festival, and was the founding executive director of the Public Foundation, where she organized the Media for Social Impact Summit at the UN for several years. Rachel worked before that also for 8 years as the special assistant to Ambassador Nancy Rubin, the US representative to the UN Human Rights Commission. She has a background in public policy, in making an impact personally, and also working with the wealthiest now to see if they can make a social impact too. And in that light, I'm delighted to actually talk to her about how she sees large wealth and pools of capital addressing the challenges of the world. Welcome, Rachel. Great to have you here with us.
Thank you so much. It's my honor.
Rachel, today we're going to talk about capitalism, the role of wealth in addressing social impact, how you see multi-generational wealth approaching this idea that you've long lived with yourself of applying capital to address the biggest challenges in the world. Can I kick off by asking you to talk about your organization, what you do there, and how you've seen the organization evolve?
Oh, yes. Thank you. What a pleasure. So 12 years ago this week, I co-founded an organization called NEXUS, which at the time was never meant to be a movement and a global organization. It was meant to be one event at the United Nations during the International Year of Youth. And so the way that the International Year of Blank works is that every year is the International Year of something. And ordinary citizens are welcome to write the UN and say that they would love to host an event under that International Year of banner. As you know, the preamble to the United Nations says, "We the peoples, not we the nations." And so in that spirit, as a torchbearer of the peoples, I wrote the UN and asked for a room to host an event uniting next gen from the world's most influential families. And they said, wonderful, you can have a room, we'll put it on our agenda in 6 weeks. And so in 6 weeks' time, my co-founder and I reached out to the Forbes 500 list and said, please send one member of your family under 40 to represent the hope and promise of the next generation in using capital and philanthropy to drive change. 75 people showed up at the event in 6 weeks' notice. Wow. And conversations were rich and powerful and deep and honest. And at the end of it, we were patting ourselves on the back. We thought, job well done, it's over. And a line of people came. We thought they were coming to thank us for organizing as volunteers. But instead they said, this was great, but there aren't enough people from India. There aren't enough people from Africa. There aren't enough people who care about climate. And we said, well, it's such a shame, but the event is over. And they said, no. We've just lit a spark. And so I said to them, well, you 75, if you each can invite 3 or 5 people from your worlds that you know are young and believe in the promise of private sector and philanthropy to drive change, I'll go to the UN and ask for a bigger room and see if we can do this again. And so that summer in July of 2011, Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General at the time, came together with us and 350 Next Gen, at the time representing 50 billion in wealth from 50 countries, to have a larger vision and a larger summit. Now, 12 years later, we have had 45 plus summits with heads of state all over the world. Our community is 6,000 next-gen philanthropists and impact investors and innovators with a combined family net worth of $750 billion, with 70 active chapters around the world, with next-gen collaborating on a daily basis to drive change.
That's awesome. Wow. And it all arose because you just thought, I'm going to write to the UN and they're going to listen and it's going to happen. So you clearly had the self-confidence that you were just going to get all the way through to the right people and make it happen.
Yeah, I think you can't get anywhere without a dream. And the idea of turning that dream into a plan is the thing that most people don't do. But once you do it, I find that with confidence, you can succeed.
That's wonderful. Now, Rachel, the people you interact with, and if we just looked at private wealth across the world, it represents about 2/3 of the world's capital. The individual has 2/3 and governments have 1/3. So, when you say we the people, quoting from the UN, it really makes sense that the people have the money. And you deal with some of the wealthiest of those people, their family offices too. What are the expectations of these people in terms of what should happen with the wealth?
I think, we're in this amazing moment in history where there will be hundreds of trillions of dollars transferring generations in the next 20 years, the biggest wealth transfer in history. And what's so exciting about that is that I see young people seeking to have more of a decision-making role in their families today, so that it's not as though upon the occasion of someone sadly passing, suddenly there's saddled with so much money with no idea what to do with it and how to be effective, responsible stewards. So I'm seeing young people sitting at the boardroom tables, getting seats in their family foundations and in their family businesses earlier with that idea that they want to learn best practices from what has worked, but also start to drive for some innovation today. And there's a much higher risk appetite in young generations around capital, more of a venture capital approach, that every dollar doesn't have to be safe and secure, but we need to really have moonshot thinking. And that's what's going to be the thing that the private sector can do that governments cannot, and that NGOs cannot. And so I think that special VC moonshot thinking risk appetite is what's really going to make that 2/3 of our world that has capital and private bank accounts be able to get us into supercharging the future we want.
Rachel, that's interesting. Now, how does your organization help that happen? And how representative now is your organization in terms of geographic mix, but also in terms of diversity?
So we have a summit almost every year in Australia, Latin America, Europe, the Middle East. And we've certainly also had summits in India, in the Caribbean, really all over. And so what I would say is that diversity is key for us. We really believe that the future will be about celebrating diversity and building bridges between peoples and countries, and that's where we're going to find the most promising solutions of a generation. What we find in terms of diversity of perspective is that the same people who applied for our summit 12 years ago and self-identified in their application as a philanthropist or an inheritor are now filling out that same application, and they're identifying as an impact investor. And so we see that the diversity perspectives of is private capital simply philanthropy has really evolved. And I don't know that it's evolved at the same rate with older generations. And so that is also helping our members to feel like they have an active and unique voice in their families that cannot be kept silent.
So you have across the world members who are wealthy, powerful, or influential entrepreneurs across the world and living in and facing the big challenges that the world faces. From your perspective, and having heard these dialogues coming in now from all across the world, as you say, what are the themes? What do you see as the biggest challenges that keep coming up?
I think that right now, the two themes that are echoing most are around climate and around forced displacement and refugees. I think that there's a lot of energy realizing that no continent is spared from fires or floods or earthquakes. It is the great equalizer, and so much of that is climate driven now. And at the same time, this often leads to, and can, as well as, wars, but so many things can lead to people not being able to stay where they historically were able to feel safe and live. And so when I look at this new generation that's rising, we grew up in a borderless world with an internet that makes you somehow sometimes feel closer to a person living in Bangladesh when you see their story and you read and watch their videos than your neighbor who you may not even go to meet, which was not the case, 50 years ago when we all knew our neighbors and hung out in our backyards, but felt completely disconnected for things happening in Africa or Asia, or let's say the Ukraine and Russia. So I think this borderless world is helping us to feel more connected, and that climate is a great equalizer, and that refugees are all of our concerns and not just the nation or the nation state those people are fleeing or fleeing to.
And Rachel, if you take some of the biggest events that have shaped the dialogue, and you just take the last year, what are some of the topics that people have spoken about, because they're so important to them?
I think there's a lot of energy right now in two spaces. One would be around the Ukraine war. That's coming up all the time because a lot of our members haven't been at an age where they could be actively engaged in supporting people who have been victimized by war. They can often remember the last war that they were party to or witness to. So how can we as private sector and philanthropists help the people who are victims of this, not the geopolitical conversation itself, but how can we show up for true victims who had nothing to do with the geopolitics? That's a big piece of it. And another big piece is looking at technology and looking at technology of everything from the future of going electric with cars and boats and other types of vehicles, but also technology in terms of our healthcare and looking at advancements where you can now take a test that will show you if you have 1,000 types of cancer, looking at technologies creating the future of food and lab-grown meat. And so all of these technological advancements across so many sectors really has everyone feeling hopeful for the first time in so long, I think, around medicine, around food, around longevity, and around reducing fossil fuels. So I think technology and futurism is a big piece, and then really figuring out how are we still in a society that can be so plagued by war, and what can we do about that? Those are the two things I think on everyone's mind today.
Interesting, and that reflects well on the news flow that we see too, at least at a global level. Rachel, do you feel that, given that your membership are the wealthy part of the world, do you feel they really have an understanding of the fundamental issues in their geographies? Do you feel they are insulated from the problems? Or do you feel that they actually live those problems themselves in some way that is meaningful?
I wouldn't say that our members necessarily live the problems of the geographies they live in, but I would say that most of them have their finger to the ground, and some feel a deep sense of responsibility to right the wrongs of history in the countries in which they live, to make adjustments where they can for how people who have been underserved and mistreated in their communities can now have a chance at equality and justice. But I think that the truth is that Nexus, our community, is not a cross-section of the wealthiest families in the world. It's a particular group of 6,000 members who've raised their hands to say, I wish to be the change I want to see in the world. So they've self-selected to be the voices for the voiceless in their countries, the ones who say, I have access and influence, but I wish to use that for change. I would say there's a larger group of people who haven't yet had that awakening or opportunity or that insight yet, and who may be really trapped with the traditional parts of wealth that are, achieve, and live and show and build and grow. But our members are the ones who fill out a 45-minute application on what is the change they're actively working to create through their resources, their access, and their connections. And so our members, I do think, hold the understanding and the truths of what's happening in their regions very close to them, and they're seeing themselves as agents of change. And when they apply every year to a summit, they have to reapply, and the top question they have to fill out is, how are they actively collaborating with other members, and how are they driving change as a result of what they've learned and who they've met through Nexus? So they're already feeling that they have to prove what they're doing, and that they're not sitting on their laurels and on their privilege. So we have the Justice League of the wealthy. It's not necessarily a representative sample.
I like that. You got the Justice League of the wealthy. Can we get really specific? What are the sorts of priorities that you've seen them apply their capital to?
So, I mean, I think that natural disasters has been a really beautiful problem for us, which is terrible to say, but when there's a natural disaster, our members go into high gear, and the result and ripple effect of that is that they then recognize that they have that ability for the future. So they can apply that same methodology and sense of hustle and collaboration when there isn't a natural disaster. So I'll give you an example. In September, early September of 2018, Hurricane Dorian hit Grand Bahama Island. Wait, no, 2019, apologies. So Hurricane Dorian hit Grand Bahama Island in September of 2019. And our members could not, I would say, have been able to point out Grand Bahama Island on a map. It's not a touristy island in the Bahamas. And when one of our members was able to share photographs in our social media groups and say, our island is under 20 feet of standing water, and our Prime Minister has said, please, no press for 3 days, no photographs. And I understand that decision and why it was made, because so much of the Bahamas makes their money off of holiday travel. And if they had shown these photographs, people might have canceled their Christmas plans. So they needed it to die down for 3 days. But when we saw those photos of grandmas on rooftops and everything with an engine, from a bus to a plane to a car being destroyed forever, because 20 feet of standing water will do that, our members rallied instantly. And the first day, they sent Black Hawk helicopters to pull people off rooftops. And the second day, they sent private planes and their net jets, ours, to one tiny landing strip, and they brought aid workers. And then the third day, they sent an armada of 55 yachts carrying generators, water, food, and medical supplies to one boat slip on this tiny island. And you've never seen yachts in a line waiting before. And so in 3 days, I would say our members did as much as they could to save that island and her people. And when I got there, a few months later, a bunch of us went to volunteer and serve food. When I got there, the Nexus logo was on water stations and food pantries, and I never gave anyone our logo, and we certainly try to operate under the radar. So I asked someone as I was volunteering in a food pantry, what's that logo? Who are they? And they said, oh, they saved our island. But they had no idea who this was, and that was our greatest joy. So from that, you could see that right after that was the pandemic. And there was so much misinformation around COVID and misallocation of PPE. And our members knew they had this new muscle that they'd operated, that they could rise and collaborate and save people and show up. And so that's what enabled us to have such great wins in delivering for people all over the world during COVID, was because they'd learned that they had this muscle and they could operate together and create incredible change.
Rachel, that's a really interesting story about reacting so fast to something so big and really making a difference. I want you to put your history in terms of the policy hat back on, the SDG Summit, and the work you did with public and in human security too. You must be itching to agree an agenda that impacts the SDGs and mobilizing capital to do that. Is that something you've done? Is that something you aspire to do, or something you will do?
So it's so interesting. We at our summits, we have bracelets for each of the SDGs designed by Cameron Saul at Bottletop. And we ask our members to put on the bracelet that aligns with the SDG that they're most excited about. And each one has a different color, as you know. So people will walk up to each other who have the same bracelet and said, what are you doing on gender equality, which is SDG 5? Or what are you doing on ocean life and life below, the sea? And so they can figure out how to collaborate, because our heartbeat is really the last of the SDGs, 17, which is collaboration for the goals and partnerships for the goals. So how do we facilitate partnerships and collaboration so that every SDG is being advanced? That's really, I think, our secret sauce, because when we have adopted one agenda from year to year with different working groups, inevitably people get really super laser focused, but other people feel, it's not really the one I care about. So if we task them with being the accelerator for each of the goals, then that's, I think, where we can add our special sauce.
And you see the SDGs as a beacon around which you can galvanize people, and that is actually happening?
I definitely think so. Yes. And we have the great privilege of calling Paul Pullman the godfather of Nexus, and we work with him a lot. And he challenges everyone to think and to speak in the language of the goals. And to, when you talk about what is your passion and what are you working on, to frame it around which goals are you addressing. And most people find that it's more than one, that when you're working on gender equality, you're also working on other SDGs also, because there's so much intersectionality. And so I think that's the beauty of the way the SDGs are framed, is that it's a circle that's connected. It's each got its own slice of the pie, but it's one pie. And I think that's really what we're able to help people frame their work around.
Rachel, that's fascinating too, because Paul is, I think he's a beacon for all of industry, actually, in terms of a man who really saw what was required and really made that impact. And it's a pleasure always talking to him too. Let me ask you, what do you think is an outcome that has happened in any of the SDGs where you've galvanized teams, where they followed through and they've made an impact?
Well, I think our SDGs around climate and the environment are one that really guided some of our efforts in early 2020. We had an initiative that members conceived of called SUPR, S-U-P-R, no E, S-U-P-R, SUPR, and it stood for single-use plastic reduction. And the idea was that our members looked at where were most single-use plastics getting used, and they resoundingly felt it was sports stadiums. And so you think about the Super Bowl, and there's, thousands and thousands of people, and each person's using about 25 single-use plastics, from their fork to the plastic their fork's wrapped in, to the top of their soda bottle, to the and on and on. And then everything gets thrown away in a plastic trash bag into a landfill. So our members mapped out with each other that 83 US-based members, families, own sports teams or stadiums, professional sports teams or stadiums. Now, I've not mapped out how many sports teams and stadiums there are in the US, but 83 seems like it's probably all of them. And so they held meetings with their parents and with the team owners and the managers of the teams and the managing directors of the stadiums to say, what can we do to remove single-use plastics? And the call to action was simple. It was a financial argument in addition to a social argument. So it became clear if we could create a financial win and source products that were seaweed straws and the like that would actually save money on the bottom line, that every stadium would switch over to this. And so they got 8 stadiums to take a pledge to go single-use plastic free almost immediately in the first month of launching, and then helped February 2020 become the first single-use plastic free Super Bowl in Miami, and saved untold amounts of plastic from going into landfills and then polluting so much of our world. And I learned during that time that each of us in the US eats a credit card's worth of plastic a month, and that's not healthy for us either. So this shows you that plastics are terrible for the environment, terrible for the climate, terrible for our health. So the intention there was to just help a sector that had never thought about this SDG and get them to become really the guardians of the future, and charge them up with how to do it and make a business case for why it's sound.
That sounds like a high impact initiative in a nation that is a big consumer, obviously, in the world, and maybe one of the biggest impacts, of course, on the use of plastics in the world as a nation. Now, are there initiatives that go across boundaries? Do you see people in poorer countries working with people from richer countries, and the entrepreneurs and capitalists that you work with figuring out how to combine forces to make an impact?
Yes. So during COVID in the early days, the UN and the WHO came to us, and they said that they had lost some goodwill, specifically in Latin America. And so our members came together with them and helped them conceive of and amplify a program called Verified, which was a double check mark, one check that the UN has verified it and one check that the WHO has verified it, meaning the messaging. And so in Latin America in particular, our members decided to organize an art hackathon. And what they did was they went to some of the poorer Latin American nations where there were art students who were trapped inside their homes for months after months, feeling that their skills and talents weren't being used to address what was the greatest problem of our age. And so these young artists in the poor Latin American countries were tasked with, over 3 days, creating beautiful pieces of art and getting masterclasses from exceptional artists and collectors. And they'd be told, create a piece in oils or in charcoal around the messaging of a safe distance, 6 feet apart, and create something beautiful around it. And also sign the name, if you can, of someone you've lost from COVID. So this doesn't feel like a generic message put out from your health department, but it feels personal, and it draws on your family history and your artistry. So these 100 artists created hundreds of pieces over the days of the hackathon from their homes, using their talents and skills, even though they thought that they were missing out on part of their education and their ability to earn money and to make a difference in their countries. And so after the art was created, we put it onto a website. And on the website, we invited our members whose families owned and had access to billboards and advertising space in the metros and on buses. We asked their families to purchase these and to showcase them. And so 10 Latin American countries showcased for months this beautiful artwork that was COVID safe messaging to get these young artists in the poor nations access, visibility, credentials, that their pieces had been shown and purchased in these incredible ways. And we're creating live campaigns, and they got recognition as well from the United Nations to help them in their careers. So that's a great example of how, a region of Latin America was able to work together to create safe messaging for themselves, to harness the beauty and the power of art and young people, and the families that owned all this advertising space were able to really do good as well.
That's a heartening story too. And it sounds like you're managing to mobilize people of influence and actually the creative spirit too, to actually make this impact that you want to make. What is the evolution of your organization, and where do you think it goes? Because the potential seems great. You said this is a self-elected or selected group that is seeking to apply wealth and also make a social impact. Do you see that continuing and in a direction that makes it even more magnified, more inclusive of other wealth that hasn't made that choice? Or where does it go, Rachel?
So I think that 12 years ago, I would have said we were a conference. Now I can confidently say we're a community. And the shift there that's happened, especially over the pandemic, as we didn't have conferences, but membership became even tighter and stronger, is that we're now 100% focused on trust. And we believe that change happens at the speed of trust. So the vision for the future, which is already happening now, is that 2 Nexus members who may not have ever met one will be moving their business into the other's country, and they'll want to figure out how can we also give back and not just intrude in that country as we scale there. And they'll call up the Nexus member and say, hi, we haven't met, but we feel this transferable trust. We've all shared the same type of experiences. We all share the same type of values and the same commitment to impact. So I'd love for you to tell me where are the causes or what are the places in your country that could use the most help from us as we enter into your country. Similarly, when we see conflict in the future, we hope Nexus members who will be seated in government will be able to speak to Nexus members who are leading industry and say, we need to call on the private sector to step up during this disaster, humanitarian crisis, or conflict. And they won't have to have the years of actually knowing each other to build that trust, but we will have this transferable trust within Nexus that if you have come to our events and you're part of our community, you share a heartbeat. and a desire to do good in a collaborative way. And so partnerships will become very easy. And we've seen that happen so much during the pandemic as we didn't have conferences, but people moved. They moved back to the countries they were from. They moved to new cities as their cities became less and less likely to be successful in terms of the careers they were looking for. And people made their entire friend groups and got jobs with each other and sought to address COVID concerns with each other without having to have pretense and agreements. And there was just such beauty in the trust. And we saw that it can be an accelerant. So that's where we're going for the future as well.
And Rachel, it sounds like from what you say, that makes you an enabler of this community. You're not there to establish a strategy for them. This is a very privileged, knowledgeable, influential crowd, and they're crowdsourcing their own challenges that they wish to address. Is that right?
I think so, yes. I mean, we are a community by members for members, and they choose what are the agenda items we focus on each year. What's so exciting too is that truly they're the future. If you were going to ask me where Nexus will be in 10 years, I would say I'd need to survey our members because they're driving what we learn about and where we collaborate. But I think the interesting piece is that every single person on earth wants to be seen and understood, but they also want to succeed and feel that they're an agent of growth in some way, that their life matters, that they're making a difference in some way, whether for themselves or their country or a cause they care about. So when you come to Nexus, people might think the first day of their summit that their affiliation on their name tag is what's most important. And does it say CEO or founder, or does it say a fancy company you've heard of? So our name tags have no titles and no affiliations. It's just your first name very large and your last name very small. And the idea is that we're rebranding what it means to be cool or successful as someone who's collaborative and driving change. And so instead of thinking of yourself of how much wealth have I amassed, it's how much wealth have I given away smartly? What investments am I making that are creating a profit for me and a net positive for the world? And so in doing this rebrand and rebranding cool and success, it means that as our members continue to move around the world, they're going to see that as the way that they want to be successful, is truly making a difference and not having to sacrifice their own success and privilege for doing it. So I love thinking that they're walking around the world in all the spaces and halls and conferences and clubs that they're in, but they're holding success in this new light.
Rachel, is there a report that captures what Nexus does? Because you've highlighted almost a values-based vision of what will happen, but is there something that captures the organization, what it achieves and its impact? And is it public or is it for members? How does it work?
We've tried really hard actually not to claim credit. So sometimes we send out communications to our members that say, look at the different initiatives that were catalyzed by Nexus or catalyzed through Nexus. But the members are the magic. And so we try very hard not to make it seem as though we are the master puppeteer. But we don't actually have a dossier of all the different things that members are doing together or independently or inspired by Nexus. But it's something we could think of. We thought of doing that for our 10th anniversary, but then it was so hard to look back when all we want to do is look forward. But I think it may be really worth doing. So thank you for that invitation.
No, it'd be delightful to actually read something about how this large pool of capital spread so much across the world with this mission of social impact is performing. And I bet there are some fantastic stories there too. Again, to putting your policy hat on and not being the puppeteer, but being somebody who's worked on these big issues. We're in that time where we still have a big split between those that have wealth and those that don't. And still, approximately half the world is not really a true participant in wealth, in the financial system, in real inclusion. Do you see changes that can be made to the model of capital that can make a big difference to that?
I think our members are actively working on creating ways to bank the people who were previously unbanked, creating new systems for getting credit scores and for savings. I think those are the pieces that our members are most actively working on. Beneath that, of course, is the concern around wanting to make sure that everyone has food and has shelter. And so I think that getting access to capital is a huge piece of this, and understanding how to make the most of the small amounts of capital that you have, whether it's 30 cents a day or $1 a day, and how to stretch that and save that. But I think our members are most concerned in this moment with figuring out how to get basic human rights and human needs met, to have people be able to go to school safely, have them be able to eat even one meal a day. Those are the primary concerns, I think, before we can even get to thinking about access to capital and distribution.
Thank you. Thank you very much for sharing that with us. And any final thoughts, please do share those as we get to the end of this.
I would just say that, people who will watch the news and sometimes be really disheartened by all the serious issues that are plaguing our society, take heart, because I go to sleep every night. Instead of watching the news, I read applications from people around the world, young people who are using their family wealth and their inherited wealth, their access to family business and their resources, to make change. And they are writing essays to me that I read every night on the vision they have for how they can use their position to alter the course of history for good. So when we think about the TikTok generation and the people who are just on their phones, know that that's maybe what the media is telling you, but there's so much good happening and so much vision and promise and hope coming from these younger generations who grew up in this borderless world and see themselves as global citizens.
I can imagine someone watching this will say, Rachel's running a club of the privileged. How about us? We're the people, we're the real people who don't have this.
I mean, I guess the interesting piece is that, yes, our theory of change is that we want to activate the people who are uniquely positioned to use capital and influence to drive change. But that doesn't mean that there aren't amazing innovators and NGOs and founders all over the world working at the grassroots level. And much of the change we're going to see over the next 50 years comes from those people. And that's a different theory of change, and we need both, and both are equally valid.
Rachel, if I'm watching this, I could be saying to myself, here's Rachel, a smart, privileged woman who has been very successful in her career, who is bold, who has put herself in a position where she has this enormous network and she's galvanizing it to make social impact. But how about other people who are just poor, and this inflation, this recessionary environment around the world, this energy crisis and so on has made them even poorer? How are we going to get more inclusion from what you see and the people you deal with? How are we going to drive a different world that gets more people included, and so that your club in the future has millions and millions, if not billions of people who want to join, because they're the poor today, but they won't be in the future?
I mean, I think our definition of poor is also shifting, because our definition of wealth is shifting. So when I look at what wealth means for our members, it's not just financial wealth, it's also social wealth. It's also the wealth of ideas and the celebration of the diversity of ideas and perspectives. So 2/3 of our network is ultra high net worth, but 1/3 are young social innovators, and they are driving social change in their countries. Some of them bought their first pair of shoes to come to our summits. Others work in plastics dumps all day or in the slums of Kibera. There are so many bright, shining stars with lived experience who are contributing back to give a hand up to others in their communities. We recently spoke with a woman who's 30 in Kenya, who's creating 100,000 meals a day for 30 cents a meal through a network of giga kitchens. I think that our theory of change at Nexus has primarily been to activate young people with the most unique access, meaning to wealth and to resources and to government. But there are equally amazing people who are the poorest of the poor, who are creating solutions in their own communities. And when I look at organizations like Ashoka or Acumen or Endeavor, they're able to find these exceptional idea people and founders and innovators. And we are trying right now in Nexus to bridge the communities of wealth of ideas with the communities of wealth and privilege, so that everyone feels they're a piece of the puzzle.
Rachel, that's really interesting. And just as we reach the end, I feel like we could start again, because you've highlighted that a third of the people are people who are entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs, impact entrepreneurs in some ways. And they're not there because they have the wealth, financial wealth, but they have something else to offer, which can have a magnified impact on communities. And that sounds like a very smart, innovative ways. And as we come across other groups of wealthy across the world and other organizations that galvanize those, I'm struggling, and maybe it's there, but I'm struggling to find others who would include a third of people who are not the ultra wealthy.
And in that 1/3 is oftentimes, there's a special selection for refugees, for people who are formerly incarcerated, and for Indigenous leaders. But whereas other organizations will put on your name tag that you're the criminal justice, fellow of the year, the reason we have no organizations or affiliations on any of our name tags is truly to create a level playing field, so that no one knows who is the billionaire next gen and who is formerly incarcerated and who's a refugee and who's an Indigenous person. Everyone knows that if you're in that room, you had a stellar application, that you are uniquely positioned to drive change. And your uniqueness is what gets you in the room. And so for some people, that's from your billionaire family. And from other people, it's because you've created an incredible solution in your local community. But everyone brings something equally unique and valuable.
Rachel, you're giving hope to lots of people, I think, who'll be watching, who'll be thinking, I don't have to become rich and then think about what I'm going to do to make an impact. I can make an impact, and either I get rich or I don't, but I can make an impact, and that is purposeful and that's meaningful. And you have a fantastic network they could plug into. And I assume they could go to your website and figure out how they apply to come to the next one and make their impact.
Yes, nexusglobal.org. And our 2023 Global Summit will be June 22nd to 24th in New York.
Fantastic. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you very much. That was good. I like that.
Thank you.
I had not appreciated you had that angle to what you do.
We're bridge building those two communities on purpose. We have a true representation of members who are equals in every way, who have incredible solutions, but not the capital to drive it. But I wish we could do this every Friday. So fun. I just love the way you think and the way you draw out stories. It's just such a pleasure.